Hello, economic students. Today we're going to continue our discussion of the various types of business organizations in the United States, and we're going to move now to corporations. And we're going to be talking about corporations now for about the next week or so. And today we're going to focus on the background of corporations and what exactly a corporation is. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. And here is a definition of a corporation. It's a business organization managed on behalf of its owners who provide the funds. Now, I want to dig into this a little bit. It's a little bit like a partnership if you think about it, in that there are multiple owners of a corporation, but with a partnership, the partners all share the responsibility of running the business. In a corporation, that's not the case. In a corporation, there are people who are hired to manage the company on behalf of the owners who provide the funds, and those funds are provided through the purchase of stock. And so the owners, the stockholders of the corporation, really do not run the company. They choose the people they wish to run the company. So ownership is represented by shares of stock. So if a corporation has 1,000,000 shares of stock and you owned 10 shares of that corporation stock, then you would own 10 1/millionths of that corporation. There are actually corporations that have over 1 billion shares of stock. So corporations, big corporations have a lot of stock, and they can have literally, millions of shareholders. A corporation is created when a state approves the corporate charter. A charter is basically the bylaws of the corporation, and a corporation cannot exist until a state approves its charter, its bylaws. And the charter typically will talk about the number of shares that are going to be offered. It'll talk about the governance of the corporation, how many people are going to be on the corporate board of directors, and that board of directors is chosen by the shareholders or the stockholders. But the charter must be approved by the state, and a corporation can charter itself in any state it chooses to do so. Many corporations are chartered here in Illinois. A lot of corporations actually get chartered in Delaware, of all places, because Delaware seems to have favorable regulatory rules regarding the chartering of corporations. So a lot of corporations do choose to charter in Delaware, a relatively small state in our nation. An interesting thing about corporations is that even though they aren't human beings, they actually have many of the same rights as people, and we're going to get into that here in a little bit. Many corporations are privately held. That means that the stock is not sold to the public. They are still corporations, but the stock is not publicly sold. Typically, this happens where a family wants to maintain control of the corporation. So that's called a privately held corporation. We play the stock market game in class, and we're investing in publicly held corporations, not privately held ones. So those corporations that are publicly traded are traded in stock markets, and we've talked about this in class a little bit already. Those markets are called stock exchanges. So let's take another look then, refresh your memory on the various stock exchanges in the United States. Of course, there is the New York Stock Exchange. It is the oldest stock exchange in the United States, and it is a huge stock exchange, and it is a physical presence, a physical building located in New York City on Wall Street. We've also talked about NASDAQ, the National Association of Securities Dealers and Automated Quotations. And NASDAQ is a virtual stock market. It is not a physical building. It's a virtual market. And again, it has a huge quantity of corporate stocks that are bought and sold there every day. We also have a stock exchange in Chicago. A lot of the same stocks that you would find on the New York Stock Exchange can be bought and sold in Chicago at the Chicago Stock Exchange. And we have the CME Group, also located in Chicago. That stands for the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, and this is an exchange that deals with a lot of what we call options, where you can buy futures. For example, you believe stock is going to go up or down in the future. You can actually buy options to buy stock in the future at a fixed price. And it's a pretty risky way to buy and sell stock. but that can be done through the CME group. They also get involved in other things such as what we would call commodities and things like buying wheat futures or cotton futures or foreign currency, that sort of thing. Let's get into a little bit of history and background on corporations. The word corporation comes from the Latin word corpus, which basically just means a body or a body of people. That's the same root word as our English word corpse, of course, which is also a body. Typically, when we think of a corpse, it's a dead body, but it's the same root. So a corporation basically is a body of people, a large body of people. Roman law granted corporations rights that are very similar to those possessed by people, and that would include the right to own property, for example. And that idea that corporations do possess rights is embedded into our Constitution here in the United States. And a lot of the same rights that people have are also owned or possessed by corporations. The earliest corporations in our Western tradition would be towns. A town would incorporate, or clubs, or even religious institutions. So for example, the city of London today is actually still incorporated. London is an incorporated city. Back in the Roman days, you might have had a temple that was dedicated to the worship of the goddess Diana. That temple could incorporate itself, which then would have allowed those who worshiped there to own property and have certain rights as a religious institution. Again, corporations having some of the same rights as human beings. The oldest corporation that is still in existence, as far as we know, is in Sweden. It's called the Great Copper Mountain in Sweden, which is incorporated in 1347, and that corporation still exists, and it has a physical location, and this is it. It's just an old copper mine, and the copper at this mine has been long depleted. There is no more copper there. But the company still exists. It is largely now just a museum about, mining, and a museum about this very, very old corporation. I've never been, but I bet you if I were in the neighborhood, I would go. I bet it's kind of interesting. A little more background on corporations. Corporations were involved in European colonialism back, after the discovery of the Americas by Columbus and others. The corporations, particularly those out of Britain, but also out of the Netherlands, did take a leading role in the settlement of the New World. British East India Company, founded in 1600. They were involved in the British tea trade out of India as the UK began to establish colonies in southern Asia, in what is today India and Pakistan. British East India Company was very strongly involved in that activity, as was the Dutch East India Company, where the Netherlands, which was at that time also a colonial power, established trading through corporations in that part of the world as well. The oldest corporation in North America is the Hudson's Bay Company, established in 1670, and Hudson's Bay Company is still a big corporation today, involved in retail. They own a lot of companies which you may be familiar with. I believe they own I can't remember if it's Nordstrom's or Lord & Taylor. Some of the big department stores that you might find in Chicago and other large cities is owned by Hudson's Bay Company. They also have their own retail outlet that you can find in some cities called the Hudson Bay Company. It'll be a little store, so specializing typically in things like woolen goods, and leather slippers and that sort of thing. These corporations were given trade monopolies by their governments. And so, for example, the Hudson's Bay Company had a huge area that they did business in, and they were basically granted a monopoly by the King of England that other corporations and individuals would not be allowed to, for example, go beaver trapping in that large area that was controlled by the Hudson's Bay Company. In fact, you can see just how much territory Hudson's Bay Company controlled. Basically, it's about a third of Canada, maybe even close to half of Canada, as well as a little bit of what is today the United States. If you wanted to go settle out there, you basically had to have the approval of the Hudson's Bay Company, and you would not be allowed to engage in any kind of business in that territory that would compete with them. Think about this idea of monopolies, that is, sole rights to do business. How do you think American colonists would have viewed these corporations? Well, probably not too favorably. In fact, it was some resentment towards this corporate power that led to the American Revolution, one of the things that led to the Revolution at least. And many of you may have heard of the Boston Tea Party. That was related to anger over a monopoly given to British corporate tea suppliers. And so the American colonists did not like corporations initially. So that gets us to the discussion of how corporations developed in America and the history of that development. Once America became an independent country, corporations were tightly controlled by the state governments. Remember, a lot of Americans had resentment towards the power of these corporations that had existed under the King of England's approval. So state legislatures were given the power to approve these corporate charters, and the states could make changes to those charters anytime. If they felt the corporation was getting too powerful or they didn't like the way the corporation was running itself, states would get in there and change the charter, change the rules under which the corporation had to operate. Excuse me. Now things start to loosen up beginning in 1819, and that's when the U.S. Supreme Court freed corporations from most state controls. For example, the Supreme Court called corporations at this time artificial persons with individuality and immortality, meaning that each corporation, like a human being, had a certain amount of individuality and it was immortal. It could conceivably live forever. And of course, we've seen that in a way. Going back to 1347, we have a corporation in Sweden that is still living. Also a part of the Supreme Court movement freeing corporations from state control, it took away the ability of states to change charters once they had already approved the charter. Once approved, a state can no longer change the charter, and so this frees the corporation from a lot of the pressures that individual states might exert towards that corporation. And really, that throughout the 19th and 20th century, beginning with that Supreme Court case in 1819, corporations continually gained more power, more rights, and indeed they become more accepted by the American people as just a fact of life that we're going to have to deal with these large companies that are called corporations. And when we talk about the rights that they have, corporations have property rights, the right to own property, and corporations even now have what we would say are free speech rights. As strange as that might seem, a corporation can advertise and basically use its same kind of free speech rights that you as an individual human being has. And with that, we're going to stop. We're going to get more into these rights that corporations have as we go through this next week. But for now, we're going to stop this presentation, check Canvas, and see if you have anything to do there. Y'all have a great day.